She was standing completely still when the wine hit her face. Not spilled, not dropped. Thrown. The glass left Vivian Mercer's hand in one clean, deliberate arc, and the dark red Cabernet landed across Serena Voss's cheek, her neck, her white dress. The liquid ran down her collarbone in slow, branching lines, like something being drawn on purpose. The music stopped. Every conversation in the room stopped. 90 people in evening wear stood frozen inside a Hamptons estate worth $12 million, and not one of them made a sound. Serena did not step back. She did not raise her hands to cover her face. She did not cry out. She simply stood there, wine dripping from her jaw onto the marble floor, and looked at her future mother-in-law with the kind of stillness that only comes from someone who has practiced not falling apart. Vivian's voice carried clearly across the room. No trembling, no regret. "I think it's time you understood something, sweetheart." She set the empty glass down on the nearest silver tray, the way you set down something you are finished with. This family has a name. This family has a history. And this family does not welcome women who come through the back door with nothing but a pretty face and borrowed clothes. Someone near the tall windows inhaled sharply. A woman in a gold dress near the fireplace took one slow step backward. Julian Mercer, Serena's fiancé, a man who had told her 3 weeks ago that he loved her more than he had ever loved anything in his life, was not in the room. He had been pulled aside by Randall Frost 40 minutes earlier, on some invented pretext, and had not returned. Serena was alone. The room watched her, some with pity, some with open curiosity. A few, the ones who had smiled at Vivian's earlier remarks over dinner. With a quiet satisfaction they were careful not to show on their faces. Serena reached up slowly and touched her own cheek. She looked at the wine on her fingertips. She looked at the dark stain spreading across her dress, a dress she had saved for 3 months to buy. And then she did something no one in that room expected. She smiled. Not a broken smile. Not the smile of someone trying not to cry. A real, quiet, private smile, as if she had just remembered something important that no one else in the room knew. She picked up a linen napkin from the table beside her, pressed it gently against her cheek, and set it back down. Then she looked at Vivian directly, not with anger, not with tears, and said, in a voice calm enough to carry without being raised, "Thank you for showing me exactly who you are. I'll remember this evening for a very long time." She walked toward the door, slowly, back straight, head up. And as she passed the last table near the exit, the older gentleman sitting there, a man no one in the room recognized, who had arrived alone and had not spoken to anyone all evening, watched her go. He nodded once to himself and reached for the phone in his inside jacket pocket. No one noticed him make that call, but that phone call, placed at 9:47 p.m. on a Saturday evening in October, was the moment everything in this story began to change. Because the man on the other end of the line already knew who Serena Voss really was, and he had been waiting for exactly this moment to act. 12 months before that evening at the Hamptons, Serena Voss was waking up at 5:45 a.m. in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment on Astoria Boulevard in Queens. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 1 window that faced the elevated subway tracks, 1 radiator that knocked through the night like a neighbor who couldn't sleep. But it was hers. She had painted the walls herself, a warm off-white she mixed from 2 half-empty cans left by the previous tenant. She had found the bookshelf at a street sale on 31st Avenue and carried it up the stairs alone. She had hung her students' drawings on the wall beside the door, framed in simple black frames she bought for $2 each at a dollar store on Steinway Street. She was 27 years old, and she had built every inch of that life herself. Serena taught art at PS 122, a public elementary school 6 blocks away. She arrived before most of the other teachers and stayed after most of them left. Her students were 7, 8, 9 years old, children who came from families that didn't have money for private lessons or museum memberships. She gave them brushes and told them the world looked different, depending on where you stood when you looked at it. She believed this. She had learned it the hard way. She had been 4 years old when her parents died in a car accident on the New Jersey Turnpike. She remembered almost nothing of them, only a smell, something like warm cedar, that she could never quite identify later in life. She grew up in a group home in Trenton, then a foster placement in Newark, then another home after that. She was 14 when a quiet man named Edward Voss appeared at the group home on a Tuesday afternoon in November and asked to speak with her alone. He was tall, gray-haired, and formal in the way of people who grew up when formality was still considered a form of respect. He sat across from her at a table in the common room and told her who he was: her mother's father, her grandfather. He had spent years searching for her after his daughter died, a search made harder by the fact that her parents had moved 3 times in the final year of their lives, and the paperwork had been slow, and the system had been slower. "I am sorry it took me this long," he said. He did not look away when he said it. Serena looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Can you prove it?" He placed a photograph on the table between them. A young woman in her mid-20s, laughing at something outside the frame. The woman had Serena's jaw, her eyes, the way she held her chin slightly up, as if ready for something. "That is your mother," Edward said. "Her name was Clara. She was 29 when she died. She would have wanted me to find you." Serena did not cry. She was 14, and she had learned that crying used energy she couldn't always replace. But she picked up the photograph. She held it with both hands. "Okay," she said. "I'll come." Edward Voss was wealthy. Not visibly, not loudly. But he was one of the most significant private real estate investors in New York, with holdings spanning 6 commercial properties in Manhattan and stakes in 3 arts endowment funds. He lived in a modest townhouse in the West Village, drove a 10-year-old Volvo, and wore the same citizen watch every day without exception. He never told Serena she was going to inherit anything. He told her she was going to learn how to see the world, how to read people, how to be patient. Those, he said, were the only things worth inheriting. She was 27 when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She was 28 when he died, on a quiet Wednesday morning in July, with Serena sitting beside him and his hand in hers. 3 months later, she met Julian Mercer. She did not know then that he was the son of the family Edward had been quietly watching for 5 years. She did not know that her grandfather had invested in the Mercer family's company, carefully and deliberately, for reasons he had never fully explained to anyone. She only knew that the man who asked her, on a rainy Tuesday at a Soho gallery, what she saw in a painting made by a blind 7-year-old. She only knew that he was the first person since Edward who asked her a question and then waited, genuinely, for the answer. What she did not know, what no one in that room at the Hamptons knew, was that Edward Voss, before he died, had written a second letter. Not to his lawyers, not to his accountant. To a man named Arthur Wren, a retired investigator who had worked for Edward for 15 years. And that letter contained 3 names, 3 instructions, and one sentence that would not make sense for another 12 months. When the time comes, make sure she is not alone in the room. The first time Serena met Vivian Mercer, it was a Sunday brunch at a restaurant called 11 Madison Park. Julian's choice. His attempt to ease the introduction with elegance and neutral ground. Vivian arrived 8 minutes late, which Serena would later understand was deliberate. She moved through the room the way certain women do. Not quickly, but with absolute certainty about where the eyes in the room were directed. She was 57 and beautiful in the way that comes from money spent correctly over many years. She wore a Dior blazer the color of charcoal and a Cartier bracelet that caught the light once, perfectly, as she sat down. She looked at Serena for exactly 2 seconds before looking at Julian. "You look thin," she said to her son. "Are you sleeping?" That was all. No greeting for Serena, no introduction, no acknowledgement that there was a third person at the table. Julian reached across and touched Serena's hand. He was trying. She could see that. "Mom, this is Serena." Vivian turned, smiled. The smile reached her cheekbones, but not her eyes. "Of course. Serena, Julian has told me almost nothing about you, which I've found very interesting." She tilted her head. "What is it you do exactly?" "I teach art. Elementary school in Queens." Queens. The word came out of Vivian's mouth as if she were identifying a species. "She's exceptional at it," Julian said. "I'm sure she is." Vivian lifted her menu. "It must be very rewarding to work with children who have so few opportunities." The sentence was constructed perfectly. Warm on the surface, a blade underneath. Serena said nothing. She picked up her own menu and decided, in the quiet of that moment, that she would not pretend she hadn't understood. After brunch, when Julian went to find the car, Vivian leaned forward slightly. "You seem like a sweet girl," she said quietly. "I only want what's best for my son. You understand that?" "Of course," Serena said. "Good." Vivian picked up her handbag. "Then I think you also understand that what's best for Julian requires a certain context, a foundation, things that take a lifetime to build." She paused. "Things that can't be borrowed." She left before Julian returned with the car. Serena sat alone at the table for 90 seconds. She looked out the window at the street below. A yellow cab slid through the November rain. A woman pushed a stroller over the wet sidewalk. Life continued, ordinary and indifferent. Then Serena looked at her own reflection in the glass. She had seen this before. Not this specifically, but something underneath it. The particular cruelty of people who believe their position gives them the right to decide who else is allowed to take up space. She had seen it at 14, standing in the group home office while a social worker read her file and sighed. She had seen it at 22, when she applied for an art teacher position, and the interviewing principal looked at her resume and said, "This is a challenging school. Are you sure you're ready?" She was always ready. She was always underestimated. And she had learned, slowly and with great discipline, that the most powerful response to underestimation was not argument. It was patience. Meanwhile, in a corner office on the 38th floor of a building on Park Avenue, Vivian Mercer was on the phone with Randall Frost. "She has nothing," Vivian said. "No family, no money, no name. I want to know everything about her by the end of the week." Randall, from the other end of the line, made a note. He was careful, methodical, and loyal, but only to whoever was paying him most. "I'll have it done," he said. What neither of them knew was that Serena's background had been intentionally cleaned by Edward Voss's legal team years ago, scrubbed of any reference to his name or his holdings, at his specific request. To anyone who investigated Serena Voss without the right keys, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a 28-year-old orphan from Queens with a modest income and no connections. And somewhere across the city, in a small office on the second floor of a building on Park Avenue with no visible signage, Helena Voss opened her laptop, read an email from Arthur Wren, and typed 3 words back. Begin the clock. 6 weeks after the brunch at 11 Madison Park, Vivian called Serena directly. Not Julian. Serena. I'd like us to have lunch. Just the 2 of us. I think we started on difficult footing, and I'd like to correct that. Her voice was warm, practiced. A mother wants to know the woman her son loves. That's all this is. Serena agreed. She chose her words carefully when she told Julian, watching his face open with relief and gratitude. She's trying, he said. I know, Serena said. She did not say what she actually believed. The lunch was at the Plaza Hotel, the Palm Court on the 5th floor, all gold light and white tablecloths and the soft clink of silverware. Vivian was already seated when Serena arrived. She stood as Serena approached and kissed her once on the cheek, the European way, and ordered sparkling water before Serena had removed her coat. The first 40 minutes were almost pleasant. Vivian asked questions about Serena's childhood, her education, her students. She listened attentively. She laughed at 2 things Serena said. She refilled Serena's water glass herself. Serena noted all of it. The warmth was real in delivery and false in intent. She had learned the difference young. Then, over the dessert course, Vivian opened her handbag. She placed a document on the table between them. Cream paper, legal font, 16 pages. I've had our family attorney prepare something, she said. Her voice remained warm. A prenuptial agreement? Standard in families like ours? George and I signed one before we married, and we've been happy for 30 years. Serena looked at the document without touching it. Of course I'd want Julian's attorney to review anything before I sign, she said. Naturally. Vivian smiled. But I thought you might like to read through it first, so there are no surprises. Serena picked it up. She read slowly and carefully, page by page, the way Edward had taught her to read anything placed in front of her. He had said, "Never let anyone rush you through a document. Anyone who rushes you through a document is hiding something inside it." By page 7, she found it. Buried in a subsection about residency and stability determinations, there was a clause. If the marriage dissolved within the first 3 years for any reason, Serena would be required to relocate outside the New York metropolitan area within 60 days. She would waive any claim to shared property. She would agree to limit contact with Julian to what was deemed medically or legally necessary. The language was designed to look standard. It was not standard. It was designed to remove her from Julian's life completely, on Vivian's terms, at any moment of Vivian's choosing within the first 3 years. Serena set the document down. She looked at Vivian. "May I take this home to read more carefully?" she asked. Vivian's smile flickered. Just slightly, just for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." Serena tucked the document into her bag, stood, and put on her coat. "Thank you for lunch, Vivian. It was lovely." She walked out of the plaza into the October afternoon, the kind of cold that comes off the park at that hour, clean and sharp. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Fifth Avenue moved around her in both directions. Yellow cabs. A man walking a dog. A woman pushing a McLaren stroller past the hotel entrance. Serena took out her phone. She did not call Julian. She called Helena Voss. She showed me the prenuptial, Serena said when Helena answered. Helena was quiet for a moment. What did you do? I took it with me. Good. Another pause. Come to the office tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, and Serena, don't tell Julian yet. Serena looked up at the plaza facade, at the flags moving in the cold wind above the entrance. There's something else, Helena said. We received confirmation this morning. Randall Frost filed a motion last week, privately, under a corporate shell. He's trying to begin the transfer of the Mercer stake before your 6-month window closes. We have 22 days. The letter from PS 122 arrived on a Thursday. Serena was in the middle of grading a stack of student drawings, abstract self-portraits from her third graders, all color and feeling and no self-consciousness whatsoever, which was the best thing about children that age, when her phone buzzed with the school's number. She answered. The voice on the other end was the vice principal, a careful man named Mr. Torres, who had always spoken to Serena with genuine respect. His voice that day was different, strained, apologetic in the way people sound when they are delivering a decision they didn't make. An anonymous complaint had been filed against her. 3 allegations: unprofessional conduct toward a student, irregularities in her teaching certification renewal, and, the most vague and therefore the most damaging, documented instability in her personal life. The school was required to investigate. She would be placed on paid administrative leave, effective immediately. She was not to return to the building until the investigation concluded. Serena sat very still after the call ended. She set her phone down on the kitchen table, beside the stack of self-portraits. A small girl named Maya had painted herself entirely in yellow, every inch of the paper. The figure barely distinguishable from the background, because Maya had told Serena once that she wanted to look like sunshine. Serena looked at that painting for a long time. Then she got up, made coffee, and began writing down everything she knew. 2 days later, the rumor appeared online. Not a news article, not anything official, just a post, anonymous, on a local social network page frequented by the kind of Manhattan social circle the Mercer family moved in, with an old photograph of Serena at a gallery opening 2 years earlier. In the photograph, she was laughing and standing beside a man none of her friends recognized. The caption said nothing explicit. It didn't need to. It simply asked, "Does anyone know who this is? I have some questions." By that evening, the photograph had been shared 41 times. Tessa Rhodes appeared in the comments, thoughtful, concerned. "I've heard some things. I really hope it's not true. Julian deserves so much better than this kind of situation." Within 48 hours, the post had reached Julian's phone through 3 separate people, none of whom had intended to hurt him. They were simply making sure he knew. He called Serena. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me this isn't what people are saying it is," he said. His voice was controlled, but underneath it something was wound very tight. "It isn't," she said. "The man in that photograph is a colleague from a gallery opening 2 years ago. I don't even remember his name." "Then why is someone posting it now? Why is there an investigation at your school?" "Julian." She kept her voice very even. "Someone is doing this deliberately. I need you to trust me." A pause, long enough to hurt. "I do trust you," he said. But the pause had already spoken. After the call, Serena sat on the edge of her bed in the dark apartment. The radiator knocked. Outside, the subway rumbled past. The city kept moving, indifferent and enormous. She opened her laptop and pulled up the file Helena had sent her the day before. A preliminary financial investigation, 43 pages, tracking Randall Frost's movements across 4 shell corporations. She read for 2 hours without stopping. Then she opened a new document and began making her own list. What she had, what she still needed, how much time was left. When she closed the laptop at 1 a.m., she noticed something she had missed the first time through Frost's documents. A routing number that appeared on 3 separate transfers. She ran it through a banking registry database Helena had given her access to. The account belonged to a holding company, and the listed contact name on that account was not Randall Frost. It was Tessa Rhodes. By the 3rd week of November, Serena had lost 4 things. Her job, her reputation, at least in certain circles, Julian's full and uncomplicated trust, and, the hardest one, the feeling that had sustained her since she was 14 years old. The certainty that if she was patient and careful and honest, things would eventually balance out. She sat one evening on the floor of her apartment, back against the radiator for warmth, her knees pulled to her chest. Rain hit the window in long diagonal lines. The subway went by, shaking the glass in its frame. She hadn't eaten since morning. She hadn't answered Helena's calls in 2 days. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. Edward had seen to that. But there is a difference between not falling apart and genuinely not feeling the weight of things. She felt it that night. All of it. The memory of Vivian's voice carrying through a room full of people who said nothing. The wine on her face. The marble floor. Her dress. The look on Julian's face during that phone call. Not angry, not cruel, but uncertain. That uncertainty was worse than anger would have been. Anger she could answer. Uncertainty meant the ground was moving under everything she had believed about them. She thought about Edward. She thought about the last afternoon she had sat beside his bed, the light coming in at an angle through the West Village window, the citizen watch on his wrist catching the sun. He had been too weak to speak by then, but he had pressed her hand once, deliberately, and she had understood it as the thing he could no longer say out loud. I see you. I always saw you. She pressed her hand flat against the floor and breathed. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Serena. The voice was a woman's, older, steady, with the particular calm of someone who had seen enough difficult things that difficulty no longer surprised her. My name is Serena Voss. I was your grandfather's closest advisor for 22 years. He asked me to watch over you from a distance. I have been doing that. A pause. I think it's time we stopped doing this from a distance. Serena didn't speak for a moment. He mentioned you once, she finally said. He said you were the most careful person he had ever trusted. That's accurate, Helena said. And right now, careful is exactly what this situation requires. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning at 8? Yes. Don't tell Julian. Don't tell anyone. Another pause. And Serena, what's being done to you is not random. It is organized, and it has a deadline. But so do we. Serena looked at the rain on the window. How bad is it? She asked. Helena took a breath. It's manageable, but only if we move correctly, and only if you trust me completely. I trusted my grandfather, Serena said. He trusted you. That's enough. She hung up and stood. She went to the kitchen and made herself a bowl of rice. Simple, warm, the kind of meal she had learned to make in the group home when she was 10. She ate it standing at the counter. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the Frost documents again. She was not done reading, and at the bottom of page 31, in a footnote that had been formatted in a smaller font than the rest of the text. The kind of formatting choice that suggests someone hoped it wouldn't be read. She found a date, a hearing date, 11 days away. And the case number attached to it matched a corporate filing that, when she searched it, turned up one name as the presiding attorney of record, George Mercer, Julian's father, a man who had no idea what was being filed in his name. The office had no sign on the door. It was on the second floor of a narrow building on Park Avenue, between a dental practice and a financial consulting firm. The elevator was small and slow. The hallway smelled like old wood and paper. Serena Voss opened the door herself. She was 61, with silver hair pinned back precisely and reading glasses resting on her nose despite the early hour. She wore a gray wool blazer and no jewelry except a single thin ring on her right hand. The office behind her was wall-to-wall files, organized by color and year. A Cartier Santos watch lay flat on the desk beside her coffee cup, the same model Edward had worn. Serena noticed the watch. She didn't say anything about it. Helena gestured to the chair across from her desk. When Serena sat, Helena opened a thick folder and placed it flat between them. "Your grandfather left you more than money," Helena said. "He left you a position. Whether you use it or not is entirely your choice. But before you can choose, you need to understand what it is." She walked Serena through it carefully. The estate, $1.4 billion in total assets, held across 6 commercial properties in Manhattan, 3 arts endowment funds, and 1 private equity stake that had been the most deliberate of all Edward's investments. 18% ownership of Mercer Commercial Group. Serena looked up from the documents. "He bought into their company." 5 years ago, Helena said. "He watched the Mercer family for a long time before he invested. He believed George Mercer was a man of integrity who had built something real. He believed the company deserved capital from someone who understood what it meant to build carefully." She paused. He did not know about Vivian's financial arrangements. No one outside a very small circle knew. "What arrangements?" Helena opened a second folder. For the next 40 minutes, she laid out what the investigation had uncovered. Vivian Mercer, over the course of 3 years, had been working with Randall Frost to quietly redirect portions of the Mercer family's operating revenue into a network of offshore accounts held under shell companies. The transfers were small enough individually to avoid automatic audit flags. Together, they totaled $11 million. George Mercer didn't know. Julian didn't know. The company's board didn't know. And the motion Frost had filed, the one Serena had found in the footnote at 1 a.m., was the final step. If it went through, it would convert a portion of the family's liquid assets into a structured vehicle that Vivian alone could liquidate. It was designed to look like routine estate planning. It was theft. Slow, careful, and almost invisible. Serena sat with this for a long moment. "Why is he filing it under George's name?" she asked. "Because if it's ever discovered, George becomes legally liable." Helena's voice was quiet. Vivian had planned for the possibility of exposure. She built herself an exit. George would be the one holding the problem. Serena thought of Julian, of the man she loved, who had a father who didn't know his wife was destroying him from the inside. "What happens if Frost's motion goes through?" she asked. "George loses the company. Julian loses his inheritance. Vivian and Frost disappear into a financial structure no one can untangle quickly enough to recover." Helena looked at her directly. "We have 11 days to stop it. What do we need?" We need to file a counter motion through your estate. As an 18% stakeholder in Mercer Commercial Group, you have standing to demand an immediate audit and to petition the court to suspend any pending transfers pending review. She paused. But your 6-month window closes in 14 days. We cannot file until that window closes. We have 3 days between your window closing and Frost's deadline. 3 days, Serena said. 3 days, Helena confirmed. And in those 3 days, we need everything. Every transfer record, every email, every communication between Vivian and Frost. Serena looked at her. I found something last night, she said. Helena waited. A routing number. It traces back to a holding company. The contact name on the account is Tessa Rhodes. Helena was quiet for 2 full seconds. Tessa Rhodes is not just a jealous ex-girlfriend, Helena said slowly. She is a named beneficiary in the secondary shell structure. She has been receiving $5,000 a month for the last 11 months. She is not working for Vivian. She is a partner. She closed the folder. And that changes everything about what we do next. Serena did not go back to her apartment that night. She sat in Helena's office until past midnight, working through documents spread across every surface of the desk. Helena made coffee at 9. Neither of them mentioned food. The building around them went quiet as the hours passed. The dental practice below dark by 6, the financial firm by 7, the whole floor belonging only to them by 9. They worked methodically. Not quickly. Quickly was how mistakes were made, and they could not afford a single mistake. Helena had retained a private investigative firm 3 months earlier at Edward's instruction, given before his death. The firm's lead investigator, a former IRS analyst named Daniel Carey, had been building the financial picture quietly for 12 weeks. What he had was substantial but incomplete. What Serena had found the night before closed one of the last gaps. They built the case in layers. Layer 1, the financial transfers. Daniel's team had traced 23 separate movements of money from Mercer operating accounts into the Shell network. Each transfer was individually small, between $40,000 and $80,000. Together, over 37 months, they totaled $11.2 million. The documentation trail was meticulous. Layer 2, the communications. Helena's team had obtained, through proper legal channels, a warrant issued on the basis of a related corporate fraud inquiry, access to 2 email accounts registered to shell companies Frost controlled. Inside those accounts were 340 emails exchanged between Frost and an address that resolved to an encrypted private server. The language was coded, but not carefully enough. Words like next movement, the window, her share, and when Mercer signs appeared consistently. Layer 3, Tessa Rhodes. The bank account was the key. $5,000 a month for 11 months from a holding company that traced directly back to Frost's Shell network. And beyond the money, Tessa's phone records, obtained through a separate subpoena connected to a financial fraud inquiry, showed 47 calls to a number registered to Vivian Mercer's personal assistant in the 14 months prior to Serena and Julian's engagement. The calls stopped 2 months ago. They didn't need to know every word of those calls. The pattern was enough. And then there was the complaint filed against Serena at PS 122. Helena's investigator had pulled the school district's intake records. The complaint had been filed through an online portal from an IP address that, after 2 levels of tracing, resolved to a device registered at an address on East 72nd Street. Vivian Mercer's address. Serena read that page 3 times. She did not make a sound. She set it down on the desk and picked up the next document. On the 12th day, 2 days before her 6-month window closed, Noah Gaines called. He had been watching Julian carefully for weeks. He had seen what the rumors were doing to Julian's confidence in Serena, and he hadn't liked it. He was the kind of friend who says difficult things in direct sentences without softening them unnecessarily. "I need to ask you something," he said when Serena answered. "Ask." "Julian is starting to pull back, not dramatically, but I can see it, and I want to know, is there something you can't tell him yet?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "How much longer?" 2 days. Noah was quiet for a moment. "Then I need you to trust me with one thing. Let me keep him in place for 48 hours. I can do that without lying to him, but I need to know it's worth it." "It's worth it," she said. "Okay." She heard him exhale. 48 hours, then you'd better make it count." She hung up and looked at Helena across the desk. "The window closes the day after tomorrow," Helena said. "At 12:01 a.m., you become the documented heir of Edward Voss's estate. At 8 a.m., we file the audit request and the counter motion simultaneously." She paused. "And at 9 a.m., I am going to call a man named Arthur Wren, who has been waiting patiently for 11 months for this exact phone call." The email arrived in Serena's inbox at 11 p.m. on the 48th day. It appeared to come from an internal Mercer Commercial Group address. The sender line read, J. Mercer. The subject line said, Timeline Confirmation. Inside, in plain language, were 3 sentences. Confirmed. Proceed as planned after the window closes. She won't contest anything once the prenuptial is in place. Serena read it twice. Then she sat very still for 40 seconds. Then she called Helena. Helena answered immediately. It was past midnight, but she answered immediately. "I just received an email," Serena said. "It appears to be from Julian's Mercer account. It confirms knowledge of the prenuptial plan and tells someone to proceed after my inheritance window closes." The line was silent for a long moment. "Forward it to me," Helena said. "Don't delete anything. Don't respond." Serena forwarded the email and then sat on the edge of her bed. The room was very quiet. She could hear the refrigerator hum. Outside, the city was doing what it always did at this hour. Not sleeping exactly, but changing its voice, becoming lower and wider. She had 2 paths in front of her. The first, believe the email. Conclude that Julian had known, had been part of this, and that everything between them had been a construction, a performance, a long and patient cruelty. The second, believe the man she had chosen, the man who had stood in a Soho gallery in the rain and asked her a question and then actually listened to the answer. The man whose hands shook, she had noticed this, when something moved him. She was aware that love was not evidence. She had seen too much of life to be naive about that. But she had also learned, under the careful instruction of a man who had built a life on reading people accurately, that character shows itself in small moments, not large ones. And in every small moment she had observed Julian Mercer, she had not seen deception. She called Noah. "I need you to check something," she said. "A Mercer Group internal email account. Can you get into that system?" "Not directly, but I know someone in their IT department. What am I looking for?" Whether an email was sent from Julian's account tonight, and whether it was sent by Julian. 37 minutes later, Noah called back. "The email was sent from Julian's work account," he said. "But not by Julian. The login was from an IP address in Midtown. I had my contact trace it. It resolves to the building where Randall Frost keeps his office. Julian was in surgery from 7 p.m. to midnight. He wasn't anywhere near a computer. Serena breathed out slowly. Frost manufactured the email, she said. He manufactured the email, Noah confirmed. And it gets worse. I found 2 other emails sent from Julian's account in the last 3 weeks, both during hours when Julian was verifiably at the hospital. Frost has Julian's corporate login. He's been building a paper trail that implicates Julian in his own plan. Serena closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the feeling had shifted. Not relief, not yet. Something colder and more purposeful. Julian needs to know, Noah said. Not yet, Serena said. I need 1 more day, after the window closes. He's not going to like that. I know. She paused. Tell him to trust me. Just 1 more day. Noah was quiet for a second. He's going to want to hear that from you. Then tell him I said it. Exactly like that. 1 more day. After she hung up, she opened her laptop and pulled up the preliminary draft of the counter-motion Helena's team had prepared. She read through it once, slowly, correcting nothing. It was precise and complete. Then she scrolled to the final page, where her name appeared as the filing party. Serena Voss, sole heir to the estate of Edward Voss. She looked at her own name for a long time. And then she thought about Vivian Mercer in a Palm Court dining room, setting down an empty wine glass with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes she has already won. The 6-month period ended at 12:01 a.m. on a Tuesday. Serena was awake. She had not slept. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching the clock on her laptop tick from 11:59 to midnight to 12:01. At 12:02, her phone rang. Helena. It's done, Helena said. The estate is now fully documented and publicly registered. Your name is on every holding. The counter-motion will be filed in 4 hours. We wanted it in the system before business hours began. And Frost's hearing? 11 days away. We'll have an injunction in place before then. Serena nodded to herself. And Arthur Wren? Helena paused. Arthur will take care of what needs to be taken care of at the Mercer building. He'll be in position by 7. Serena had not yet met Arthur Wren. She knew only that he was a retired investigator, that Edward had trusted him for 15 years, and that he had been the man sitting at the last table near the exit at the Hamptons estate on the night of the party. The man who had made a phone call at 9:47 p.m. She had not recognized him that night. She had only noticed that he watched her leave without pity and with something that looked more like recognition. At 8:04 a.m., Helena's office filed 2 documents simultaneously. The first was a formal notice of estate settlement, publicly registering Serena Voss as the heir of the Edward Voss estate, with full asset disclosure attached. The document was 41 pages. The financial figures were in the first paragraph. The second was an emergency petition to the Manhattan Commercial Court, a request for an immediate audit of Mercer Commercial Group, and an injunction against any pending transfers of corporate assets, citing evidence of financial fraud by a named party, Randall Frost, operating under false authority. The petition named Vivian Mercer as a co-conspirator. By 9:15 a.m., both documents had been time-stamped, assigned case numbers, and entered into the public court record. By 9:47 a.m., a reporter from the New York Times business desk had found the estate filing. By 10 a.m., Randall Frost received notification from his bank that 3 accounts had been frozen pending judicial review. He called Vivian immediately. Her phone rang 4 times. She did not answer. She was sitting at the breakfast table in the Hamptons, reading the paper. She had driven out the previous evening for a long weekend, a habit she had kept since Julian was a boy, a ritual she associated with order and control. She was on the second cup of coffee when she turned to the business section. The headline was not large. It was tucked in the lower right corner of the page. A brief item, 2 paragraphs, the kind of notice that means very little to most readers, and everything to the right ones. Estate of Edward Voss formally settled. Sole heir identified as Serena Voss, 28, of Queens. Associated holdings include commercial properties and a minority stake in Mercer Commercial Group. Vivienne read it once, then again. The coffee cup was still in her hand. It slipped. She did not catch it. It hit the marble tile and shattered, and the coffee spread across the floor in a dark, slow pool. And Vivienne Mercer sat in her chair and stared at the paper with the expression of someone who has just understood, all at once, the true dimensions of a mistake they cannot take back. Her phone rang again. This time it was not Frost. It was her own attorney, the one she paid a separate retainer, the one she had always kept separate from the family's legal matters, the one who only called when something had gone wrong at a level that could not be fixed quietly. She answered. He said 4 words. She said nothing in response, because there were no words for what he had just told her. Federal investigators had arrived at Frost's office building at 9:45 a.m., and Frost had not been alone when they found him. Vivienne did not panic. That was the thing about her, and it was the thing that had made her dangerous for so long. She did not panic. She assessed. She calculated. She found the next viable position and moved toward it before the current one had fully collapsed. Within 2 hours of reading that newspaper, she was back in Manhattan, in the office of her private attorney, a man named Charles Aldrin, who operated from a townhouse on East 64th Street, and whose client list no one had ever successfully obtained. She told him everything, not because she trusted him unconditionally, but because she understood that a lawyer who doesn't know the facts cannot protect you from them. Aldrin listened without expression. He took 12 pages of notes. When she finished, he set down his pen. "Randall Frost is a liability," he said. "Randall Frost is cooperating with federal investigators as of this morning," Vivienne said. "That's been confirmed." "Then he's an active threat." Aldrin folded his hands. "We move to distance you from him immediately and publicly. We file a counter-narrative. You were a victim of Frost's financial misrepresentation, not a co-conspirator. You trusted him. He deceived you." "Will that hold?" "It depends on what he has documented." He paused. "What does he have, Vivienne?" She was quiet for a moment. "Emails," she said. "But they're coded. No one can prove intent from the language." Aldrin considered this. "And the girl? The Voss heir?" "She has the stake in Mercer. She has standing to file the audit petition. But she's 28 years old with no litigation experience and a public defender-level credibility gap." Vivienne's voice hardened slightly. "We challenge the estate. We argue that Edward Voss was not of sound mind when he filed the amended bequest. He was ill. He was on medication. There were documented lapses. That's a difficult argument to win. I don't need to win it. I need to delay it long enough to reposition." She straightened, and we launched the counter-narrative in the press. Serena Voss is a woman who inserted herself into a family for financial gain. She targeted my son. She cultivated access to our inner circle in order to position herself as a legitimate heir to a fortune she had no authentic connection to. Aldrin looked at her. "She is the documented granddaughter of Edward Voss." People have complicated relationships to bloodlines when money is involved, Vivian said. The public doesn't need proof. It needs a story that feels possible. Within 12 hours, the counter-narrative was moving. A lifestyle podcast in Manhattan published an interview with Tessa Rhodes. The episode was titled, "When Love Becomes a Long Con." Tessa's name was not attached to it. The guest was listed as a friend who knows both parties. She spoke carefully, choosing words that stopped just short of accusation. She painted a picture of a young woman from nowhere who had maneuvered herself into proximity with a powerful family. The post received 42,000 plays in the first 6 hours. Social media did what social media does. Comments split between outrage at Serena and outrage at the Mercer family. Celebrities who had nothing to do with any of it weighed in. Someone created a hashtag. Vivian watched the numbers from her apartment on the Upper East Side, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt something adjacent to confidence. She believed she was gaining ground. She did not know that every word of the podcast episode had been recorded. She did not know that Tessa's phone, 3 days earlier, had been the subject of a lawful intercept order connected to the financial fraud case. An order that captured not only calls, but also a voice memo Tessa had recorded for her own reference the night before the episode aired, in which she rehearsed her talking points and said, clearly and without ambiguity, "Vivian needs this to stick for at least 2 weeks. That buys her enough time to move the last account." Serena Voss had anticipated the counter-narrative. She had, in fact, counted on it. 3 weeks earlier, when they were building the case in her Park Avenue office, she had told Serena something that Serena had written down and kept. People who believe they are winning become careless. They say more than they need to. They move faster than is safe. And when they move faster than is safe, they make the kind of mistakes that don't require interpretation. Tessa Rhodes had made that mistake at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, in a voice memo recorded on a phone that was already the subject of a lawful intercept. The audio was delivered to Helena's team at 8 a.m. Thursday. By 8:30, it had been reviewed by Daniel Carey and forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, accompanied by the full financial documentation, the email intercepts, the IP address verification linking Frost to Julian's fraudulent emails, and the school district records tracing the anonymous complaint back to Vivian's residential address. At 9:02 a.m. on Thursday, 2 federal agents entered Randall Frost's office on Park Avenue. They did not rush. They showed their credentials at the front desk, rode the elevator to the 31st floor, and walked into Frost's conference room, where he was sitting across from 2 clients and a junior associate. The clients were asked to leave. Frost looked at the agents. He had been a careful man his entire career, careful in the way of people who know they are doing something wrong and believe that carefulness is a substitute for ethics. It was not. He was told he had 2 options: cooperation or silence. Cooperation would be noted. Silence would not help him. He chose cooperation before the agents had finished the second sentence. Within 4 hours, Frost had provided a signed statement confirming the existence of the shell network, the financial transfers, the nature of his arrangement with Vivian, and, crucially, the fact that the anonymous school complaint had been Vivian's idea, executed through her assistant using her home internet connection. He confirmed that Tessa Rhodes had been paid 11 months of retainer fees through the Shell network in exchange for her social media activity and the podcast episode. He confirmed that the email sent from Julian's account had been sent by him, from his office, using login credentials Vivian had provided. At 2:15 p.m. that same afternoon, the Manhattan Commercial Court issued an emergency injunction. Frost's pending motion was suspended, All associated transfers frozen. The court-appointed auditor given immediate access to Mercer Commercial Group's financial records. At 4 p.m., Vivian Mercer received a formal notice that she was named as a co-defendant in a federal fraud case. George Mercer, who had spent 40 years building his company and had spent the last 3 years being slowly dismantled from the inside by someone he slept beside every night, received a phone call from the company's CFO at 4:15 p.m. He sat in his office chair for a long time after the call ended. Then he called his son. Julian was between surgeries. He stepped into the hallway and took the call. When his father finished speaking, Julian said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "She knew, didn't she? Serena knew." George's voice was quiet. "I think she's known for a while." Julian hung up and stood in the hospital corridor for a long moment. White walls, the smell of antiseptic, the low hum of machinery somewhere behind a closed door. He understood now what Serena had been doing in her silence. He understood the cost of it, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he had made her carry that alone. The emergency shareholders' meeting of Mercer Commercial Group was called for the following Monday morning. The venue was the company's primary conference room on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, a room Serena had never been in, a room she had no reason to have been in, a room where decisions affecting hundreds of millions of dollars had been made for 30 years without her knowledge or presence. She arrived at 8:55 a.m. Helena walked beside her. Daniel Carey 2 steps behind. Serena wore a dark navy blazer over a white shirt. Her hair was down. No jewelry except a thin silver ring on her right hand. The same ring she had worn every day since Edward gave it to her on her 20th birthday. She had not purchased anything new for this occasion. She did not need to. The room was already full when she entered. 12 people at the table, board members, the company's CFO, 2 outside counsel attorneys, and George Mercer at the head, a man she had never met, who looked up when she walked in with the expression of someone seeing something he had long wondered about and was only now being allowed to look at directly. Julian was standing in the corner of the room, to the right of the window. He was in a suit, unusual for him on a Monday, when he was usually in surgical scrubs by this hour. He had rearranged his schedule. He had been here since 8. When Serena entered, he looked at her. She did not look at him. Not yet. Helena placed the documentation on the table, the full estate filing, the audit petition, the shareholder notice, all court-stamped and organized. She spoke briefly, identifying Serena and her standing as an 18% stakeholder, the nature of the fraud that had been uncovered, and the scope of the audit now underway. The room was very quiet. The CFO, a man named Robert Teague, who had worked for the company for 20 years, was the first to speak. He looked at the documents for a moment, and then looked at Serena directly. "The account irregularities we've been trying to source for 8 months, he said. "This explains them." "Yes," Helena said. George Mercer had not spoken. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and looked at the documents in front of him. He was 61 years old, and something in his face that morning looked older than that. Not broken, but reduced, the way a man looks when he has understood something that required him to revise 30 years of assumption. He looked up at Serena. "Your grandfather," he said. "Edward Voss. I met him once, 12 years ago, at an industry conference in Chicago. He asked me 3 questions about how I ran the company. I remember thinking it was an unusual conversation." He paused. "I didn't know he invested in us." "He didn't tell many people what he invested in," Serena said. "He thought it reduced the quality of the relationship." George looked at her for a long time. Then he stood. "I want to say something to you on behalf of this family." His voice was steady, but not entirely. "What was done to you, what was said to you in this family's house by a member of this family, is not something I can undo. I am deeply sorry for it." The room was completely still. Serena looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "What matters now is the company." It was exactly what Edward would have said. Julian, in the corner of the room, pressed his lips together and looked at the window. At the midtown skyline beyond the glass, gray and enormous and indifferent to everything happening in this room. When the meeting concluded and the room began to empty, Julian moved toward Serena. She was gathering documents. She did not look up until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she would have to acknowledge him. He said her name. Just her name. And the way he said it. Not as a question. Not as an explanation. Just her name, in the voice of someone who understood that all other words were insufficient. Made her go still. The federal indictment came on a Wednesday. 4 counts. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and intentional misuse of fiduciary authority. Randall Frost was named as co-defendant. The indictment was 47 pages and had been built by the U.S. Attorney's Office over 3 weeks, using the documentation Helena's team had provided, supplemented by Frost's own testimony. Vivian Mercer was at her apartment on the Upper East Side when her attorney called with the news. She was in the kitchen. She did not say anything for a moment after he finished speaking. "What are my options?" she said. "Limited," Aldrin said. "Frost has already cooperated fully. The financial trail is documented at a level that doesn't leave interpretive room. And the voice memo from Ms. Rhodes removes the last viable deniability argument." The estate challenge was dismissed this morning. Edward Voss's medical records were subpoenaed and reviewed by a court-appointed specialist. No evidence of cognitive impairment at the time of the filing. The challenge has no standing. Vivian sat down at the kitchen table. "Then we negotiate," she said. "Yes," Aldrin said. "That is what we do now." The negotiation resulted in a plea arrangement. 3 counts reduced, with cooperation regarding a broader investigation into the financial networks Frost had used. Vivian was sentenced to 4 years, with 2 suspended pending continued cooperation and compliance. She was required to surrender all personal assets acquired through or associated with the fraudulent transfers. The East 72nd Street apartment, 2 investment accounts, and a vacation property in Connecticut she had purchased 18 months earlier with funds that traced back to the Shell network. What remained of her personal wealth after the surrender was enough to live on. Not comfortably. Not in the way she had lived for 30 years. George filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the indictment. His attorney described it as a decision reached after careful reflection. In practice, it had been reached at the same moment George sat in the Chrysler Building conference room and understood what his wife had been doing, not just to the company, not just to Serena, but to him. She had been building a case against him. She had been planning to exit and leave him holding the evidence of her crimes. The divorce was finalized in 8 months. Vivian's social world, the one she had spent decades cultivating, the lunches at the Palm Court, the charity galas, the dinner parties where she set the table and decided who sat where, evaporated with a speed that surprised no one who had ever watched these circles closely. They were not communities of loyalty. They were communities of status. And status, once it begins to fall, falls alone. By the following spring, Vivian Mercer was living in a 2-bedroom rental in Westchester. Her number had been quietly removed from the invitation lists of every event she had previously attended. The women who had stood with champagne glasses at the Hamptons party and smiled at her remarks about Serena did not call to check on her. They were careful that way. Randall Frost received 6 years. His law license was permanently revoked. The legal community he had navigated for 30 years was not forgiving of attorneys who weaponized their access to clients' information. He did not contest this. He had cooperated. He understood what cooperation had purchased and what it hadn't. Julian visited his mother once, 3 months after the sentencing. He drove to Westchester on a Tuesday morning, sat across from her in the kitchen of her rental apartment, and spoke for 20 minutes. No one knows exactly what was said in that conversation, but he did not stay for more than an hour, and when he left, his face held the particular blankness of someone who has said everything they needed to say and knows there is nothing left that requires saying. The New York Times piece ran on a Friday. It was not a long article, 12 paragraphs, below the fold in the business section, the kind of item that reads as a footnote to the larger story of the Mercer fraud case. But its scope was precise, and its sourcing was documented. Tessa Rhodes, named as a paid participant in the disinformation campaign against Serena Voss, had received $55,000 over 11 months from shell accounts connected to Randall Frost. The Times reporter had reviewed the bank records and the voice memo transcript. Both were quoted sparingly and with care. The article did not accuse Tessa of criminal wrongdoing. Her attorneys had already established that she had not been aware of the full scope of the fraud, only her portion of it, and the U.S. attorney had declined to charge her given the relative scale of her involvement. But it documented clearly and for the public record what she had done. She had accepted money to plant stories, manipulate social media, and undermine a woman's reputation for personal and financial gain. The response from Tessa's social world was faster and more complete than even Vivian's had been. She was removed from the board of the Literacy Foundation she had joined 4 months earlier. The organization sent a brief statement noting that the decision was effective immediately and that the board wished her well in her future endeavors, the kind of language that means the opposite of what it says. 3 event committees declined her offers to volunteer. A profile piece that a lifestyle magazine had been preparing about her and her philanthropic work was quietly shelved. The writer sent a brief email saying the piece was no longer a fit for the publication's direction. Her closest friends in the social circle, the ones she had spent years cultivating, the ones she had called the night before the podcast episode aired, became unavailable, not dramatically, not with confrontation, simply unavailable. One of them, a woman named Caroline who had been Tessa's closest confidant for 6 years, sent a single text message. "I'm going to need some space. I hope you understand." Tessa replied. Caroline did not respond. 3 weeks after the Times piece, Tessa Rhodes left New York. She relocated to Seattle, where she had a cousin who managed a small nonprofit focused on early childhood education. She took a position there, administrative, not leadership. Her name did not appear on any public-facing materials. She did not announce the move on social media. She simply stopped posting. And then, 4 days before Serena and Julian's wedding, a direct message appeared in Serena's inbox. The sender was Tessa Rhodes. It was 7 sentences long. She did not excuse what she had done. She did not ask for forgiveness. She said she had thought about it every day since the voice memo was revealed, and that the clearest thing she understood now was that she had chosen badly. Not once, but repeatedly, because it was easier to serve someone else's agenda than to examine her own. The last sentence read, "You deserved better from the beginning. I think you always did." Serena read the message twice. She did not respond right away. She put the phone down and finished making the cup of tea she had been making when the notification appeared. Later that evening, she showed the message to Julian. He read it without expression. Then he set the phone down. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. Serena picked up her tea. "Nothing," she said. "I'm going to leave it there. Some things don't need a response. They just need to have been said." He came to her apartment on a Thursday evening, without calling ahead. Serena heard the knock and looked through the peephole before opening the door. Julian was standing in the hallway, in a coat she recognized, the dark gray one he wore on the weekends, not the formal one, not the one that meant he was performing something. He was carrying nothing, no flowers, no prepared speech. His hands were in his pockets. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment without moving. Then he said, "I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now." She stepped back to let him in. He came in and stood just inside the door, not moving further into the apartment, as if he understood that this was her space and he had to be invited into it properly. "I didn't stand up for you that night in the Hamptons," he said. "I wasn't in the room when it happened. But I had seen enough before that evening to know what my mother was capable of, and I had chosen for years to manage her rather than confront her. That choice had consequences. You paid them." Serena said nothing. She was listening. "I'm not here to explain that or excuse it. I'm here because I want you to know that I understand what it cost you, and I want you to know that I am not the same person who walked out of that room to talk to Frost, while my mother humiliated you in front of 90 people. He looked at her directly. "I can't undo any of it, but I can be different going forward, and I will be, if you'll let me show you that." Serena looked at him for a long time. She had thought about this moment, not obsessively, but clearly, the way she thought about most things that mattered. She had considered what she would need from him and what she would not be willing to accept. She had thought about whether the man she had chosen at a gallery in the rain was still the man standing in front of her, or whether that man had been an idea she had built more from hope than observation. She had concluded that hope and observation were not always opposites. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. They talked about things they had never talked about before, not because they had avoided them, but because there had not yet been a moment that demanded them. About his father, about her years in the group home, about Edward and what kind of man he was, and why he had made the choices he had. About what it meant to trust someone who came from a different world than yours, and whether world was the right word for it, or whether the real word was wound. At some point, Julian said, "I want to tell you something your grandfather told me. Except he didn't know he was telling me. He wrote it in a letter he left in the documents Helena gave to my father, a paragraph that wasn't addressed to anyone, just sitting there. It said, 'The people worth keeping are the ones who can tell the truth when it costs them something.'" He wrote that? He wrote that. She looked at the table for a moment. At the Kindle beside her coffee cup, still open to the page of meditations she had been reading when Julian knocked. "There's something in that letter that I haven't told you yet," Julian said. She looked up. "He wrote about you, about what he saw when he watched you, not in the group home, not in Queens, when he watched you the night of the Hamptons party." His voice was careful. "He was there, Serena. He was the man at the table by the door. Arthur Wren was working for him. He watched you walk out of that room, and he wrote, "She didn't need saving. She never did. But she deserved someone standing beside her. And I intend to make sure she has it." Helena had been holding the letter for 11 months. She gave it to Serena on the morning after the shareholders' meeting, delivered by hand to the apartment in Queens, in a cream envelope with no return address. Just Serena's name, written in Edward's handwriting, which she would have recognized anywhere. She opened it alone. She made coffee first, then sat at the kitchen table in the early light and opened the envelope carefully, the way Edward had always taught her to open things that mattered. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in his precise and unhurried script. He began not with the estate, not with instructions, not with the explanation she might have expected. He began with an apology. "I kept too many things from you for too long," he wrote. "I told myself it was protection. I have spent these last months wondering if it was also cowardice. The particular cowardice of people who love something so much they cannot bear to let it be tested. You were tested anyway. That is the nature of life. It does not ask our permission." He wrote about her mother, Clara, things Serena had never known. That she had been a painter, not a professional one, but seriously committed, painting in the kitchen of their apartment on weekends while Serena's father read the paper at the table. That she had talked about Serena before Serena was born, the way some people talk about a place they have not been to yet, but feel certain is real. That she had been, in Edward's words, "the most honest person I ever raised," which meant the world disappointed her more than it should have. He wrote about the investment in Mercer Commercial Group. "I bought into their company because I believed George Mercer was building something with integrity, and I believe in rewarding that. I did not know what his wife was doing. I did not know you would end up connected to that family by something other than capital. I wonder sometimes if I should have known, if I saw something and chose not to look at it closely enough. You will have to make your own judgment about what to do with the stake. Keep it or sell it or give it away. I only ask that whatever you decide it on your own terms, not anyone else's." And then, near the end, "The boy. I have watched him. I am not a sentimental man, but I believe he is honest in the way that matters. Honest about what he doesn't know, which is rarer than honesty about what one does know. He is not yet the man you need him to be, but I believe he can become that man if the situation demands it." He paused in the letter. There was a small break, a line, as if he had set the pen down and come back. "The situation will demand it," he wrote. "I have made sure of that." Serena sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down Astoria Boulevard. A child laughed somewhere down the street. The city was ordinary and vast and completely indifferent to the fact that she was sitting at this table with a letter from a man who had loved her more carefully than anyone else ever had, and who had known, months before his death, almost exactly what was going to happen. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then she called Julian. He answered before the second ring. "Can you come over?" she said. "I'm already on my way," he said. She looked at the door. "How long have you been on your way?" A pause. "About 20 minutes. She almost laughed. "Helena called you." "Arthur Wren called me." She shook her head slowly. "My grandfather planned everything, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. Julian's voice was very quiet when he answered. "He planned everything except one thing." She waited. He didn't plan for me to fall in love with you before I understood what that meant. That part, I think, was mine. The Edward Voss Foundation launched on the first Saturday of March. The venue was the River Cafe in Brooklyn, chosen deliberately. Not the Plaza, not the Hamptons, not any room that held the memory of something meant to diminish her. This room looked out over the East River, and across the water, the Manhattan skyline rose in gray and silver morning light, and it looked like a beginning rather than a statement. 200 people filled the room. Not all of them were wealthy. Not all of them were important in the way that word is usually used. There were teachers from PS 122. There was a group of foster care alumni from New Jersey who had read about the foundation in a community newsletter. There was a 12-year-old girl named Maya, the same Maya who had painted herself entirely in yellow, who had been invited personally by Serena, and who arrived with her mother and spent the first 10 minutes looking at everything with wide, careful eyes. Serena stood at the front of the room without notes. She did not introduce herself by way of the estate. She did not open with a financial figure or a board statement or any of the formal language of institutional philanthropy. She opened with a story about a group home in Trenton and a Tuesday in November, and a man who sat across a table from a 14-year-old girl and waited for her to trust him instead of demanding it. The room was quiet from the first sentence to the last. The Foundation's mission: to provide arts education access to children in foster care, group homes, and under-resourced public schools across the New York metropolitan area. Funded initially at $12 million. A figure Serena had chosen herself. One she could have made larger and had chosen not to, because she believed the work should grow with the proof of its own effectiveness, rather than on the weight of a number. Helena sat in the first row. She wore the same gray blazer she had worn the morning Serena first came to her office, and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and twice during Serena's remarks, she pressed her lips together in the way of someone who is not going to cry in public, but is having to work at it. George Mercer was in the room. He had asked Helena if he might attend. He sat near the back, quietly, and did not introduce himself to anyone. He stayed through the entire program and left before Serena had made it to the back of the room to greet people. On his way out, he stopped at the guest table and wrote something in the comment book. When Serena found it later, it said only, "Your grandfather would be proud. So am I." GM. Julian stood to the side during the speeches. He was not introduced. He was not up front. He had understood, without being asked, that this day was not about being beside her in a way that was visible. It was about being there in a way that was real. After the speeches, after the program, after Maya had shown Serena a new drawing she had done at home, a figure standing at the edge of a river, looking at a city, Serena found Julian near the window. The river was silver. The skyline was bright. He handed her a coffee from the side table. She took it. They stood together for a moment, not speaking, looking at the water. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small box. He held it without opening it. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "I had a whole speech planned," he said. "I practiced it. It was good. I had 3 different openings." She looked at the box in his hand. What happened to it? He finally looked at her. "I got here and I saw you stand up in front of those people and tell the truth without flinching, and everything I'd prepared sounded like I was describing someone else's story. So I'm just going to say this. I love you. I have loved you since a Tuesday in November in Soho, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life learning how to deserve you." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple. A single stone, no elaborate setting, the kind of ring that would not look out of place on any day. He had understood her that well, at least. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, then at him, then at the river. She took a breath, and she said yes. They were married on the second Saturday of May in the garden of a small arts residency in Hudson Valley. Serena had found the place herself, an hour and a half north of the city, on 8 acres of open land with a converted barn that served as a gallery space, and a garden that in May was full of something wild and unplanned, the kind of flowers that grow because nothing has stopped them. She had gone alone for the first visit, driven up on a Wednesday morning, walked the whole property, and sat on a stone wall for 20 minutes, looking at the mountains in the distance. Then she called Julian and said, "Here." He had not seen the venue before the day of the wedding. He trusted her. 42 guests. Not 4,200. Not 400. 42 people who were there because they were genuinely part of the story. The ones who had seen the difficult parts and remained, or who had become real during the difficult parts and stayed. Helena sat in the first row on Serena's side, a side that had no family by blood, which was the kind of fact that used to feel like loss and now felt simply like a different kind of truth. Helena wore pale blue. She had not told Serena what she would wear, and Serena had not asked. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was in the first row. George Mercer sat 3 rows back, on his own, and nodded once when Julian walked past him on the way to the altar. Noah Gaines stood beside Julian as best man, holding the rings in a small wooden box that had belonged to Edward Voss. Serena had given it to Noah the night before, without explanation, and he had understood without needing one. Maya was there. She sat between her mother and a girl from her class, and when Serena walked into the garden, Maya leaned forward in her chair and watched with the specific attention of a child who wants to remember something exactly. Serena wore white, not a large dress, not elaborate. Simple, with a small amount of lace at the collar and cuffs. The kind of dress that looks like it was chosen by someone who knew who they were, and dressed accordingly. Her hair was down. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers, things she had cut that morning from the property's edge, damp with dew, still smelling of the field. She walked herself down the aisle. She had thought about this. She could have asked George. She could have asked Helena. She had decided that walking herself was not a statement and not a performance. It was simply the truth. She had brought herself here. That deserved acknowledgement. When she reached Julian, he looked at her the way he had looked at her across a room once before, in a gallery in Soho, in the rain, before either of them knew what the other was, with the same openness, the same lack of performance. George Mercer, who had spent 30 years married to a woman who was always performing something, noticed that look from 3 rows back. He looked at his hands. The ceremony was 22 minutes. A friend of Noah's, a judge who did this for couples he knew personally, led them through vows they had written themselves. Julian's vows were specific and honest in the way of someone who had learned that generalities are a form of hiding. Serena's were short, 4 sentences, and left the room in a silence that said more than applause would have. They did not release doves. They did not have a choreographed first dance. They had dinner in the barn, with the gallery walls around them hung with pieces from the Edward Voss Foundation's first student exhibition. Small works, made by children, full of color and intention, and no self-consciousness at all. At some point in the evening, Noah stood and offered a toast. He spoke for 4 minutes. The last thing he said was, Edward Voss once wrote in a document none of us were supposed to read. She didn't need saving. She never did. But she deserved someone standing beside her. Today, she has that, and it's the best thing I've seen in a long time. Helena raised her glass. Maya, who had been allowed to stay for the toasts, raised her glass of apple juice. And somewhere in the general movement of that moment, the raised glasses, the soft light in the barn, the sound of the field outside where nothing had stopped the wildflowers from growing. Julian leaned close to Serena and said something that only she could hear. She laughed first. Then she turned and looked at him with something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but something deeper and quieter than both. The particular warmth of a person who has finally arrived somewhere they were not sure existed. She set her glass down. She took his hand. And she stayed. The year that followed was not without difficulty. Serena had not expected it to be easy. She was not a person who confused the end of one hard season with the end of hard seasons generally. But the difficulty that came after was a different kind. It was the kind that comes from building rather than surviving. The kind that exhausts you in a way that feels like something instead of nothing. The Edward Voss Foundation, in its first full year, served 340 children across 14 schools and 6 residential care facilities in the New York area. The program employed 11 art educators, all of them chosen by Serena personally, through a process that took 4 months and involved visiting each candidate's classroom or studio and watching them work without announcing herself. She did not want teachers who performed well under observation. She wanted the ones who were the same whether anyone was watching or not. She had learned to recognize that quality. Edward had taught her how. Maya turned 9 that spring and painted a series of 7 pieces she called Things I Know Are Real. Each one was a different color. The 7th one was entirely white, and when Serena asked her about it, Maya looked at it for a moment and said, "That one is for things I know are real but haven't seen yet." Serena had it framed and hung it in her office. Julian remained at New York Presbyterian. He joined the foundation's board in the fall, not as a figurehead, but as the chair of the Medical Advisory Committee, a role that became real when he helped design the foundation's program for children with disabilities, drawing on his neurosurgical experience in ways that would not have been possible without it. The work surprised him. He had not known that he was missing something until he found it. George Mercer rebuilt the company in the 18 months following the audit. The process was difficult and public and at times humiliating. Full disclosure of the fraud, the resignation of 2 board members who had looked the other way, a restructuring that required the company to operate at reduced capacity for nearly a year. But at the end of it, the company was cleaner than it had been in a decade. Robert Teague, the CFO who had spent 8 months trying to trace the irregularities Vivian had created, was promoted to president. He had, in the company's darkest moment, been the one who kept it running. George did not rush back into the world. He sold the Hamptons estate. He moved to a smaller house in Connecticut near the water, where he began doing something he had not done in 40 years. Woodworking. He built things with his hands. Julian visited once a month. Serena came with him when she could. They ate dinner, and sometimes they walked along the water in the late afternoon, and none of them talked about the past, unless one of them wanted to, which was rarer than it had been at the beginning. Vivian Mercer served 14 months of her 4-year sentence before being released on medical grounds. She was living quietly in Westchester. She did not attempt contact with Julian. He had told her, in the conversation at her kitchen table, that he was not closing a door, but that the door would remain his to decide about, on his terms, at his pace. She had accepted this. It was not a happy ending for Vivian, but it was an honest one. And honesty, Edward had believed, was the only foundation on which anything real could stand. Serena still went to her studio in Brooklyn every Monday morning. The studio was a rented room on the second floor of a building in Bushwick. Plain walls, north-facing window, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine that she had loved since she was 14 years old, and Edward had first taken her to see an art studio. She painted there alone, without agenda or audience. She was not building toward a show or a collection or a reputation. She was simply doing the thing she had always done, looking at the world from where she stood and trying to understand what she saw. One Monday in October, 2 years after the night at the Hamptons, she was painting when her phone buzzed. A message from Helena. "I found something in the Edward files we hadn't cataloged yet. A photograph. You as a baby, with your mother, taken on a Sunday in Central Park." She is laughing. "You are not looking at the camera. You are looking at a pigeon that landed near the blanket. Your grandfather wrote on the back, 'The first time I saw how she looks at the world.'" Serena set down her brush. She sat very still for a moment. Then she typed back, "Can I have it?" Helena replied within seconds, "It's been waiting for you." The photograph arrived by courier that afternoon. Serena looked at it for a long time. Her mother's face, her own face, 7 months old, gazing with complete attention at something small and ordinary that most people would have ignored. She set it on the windowsill beside her easel, where the north light fell on it every morning. And then she picked up her brush and kept working. This is the end of the story. But here is the truth underneath it, the one worth carrying. Justice does not always arrive the way we imagine it. It does not always arrive loudly. It does not arrive with a speech, or a confrontation, or a single dramatic moment of reversal. Sometimes it arrives in a set of documents filed quietly before business hours. Sometimes it arrives in a voice memo recorded carelessly. Sometimes it arrives in a man standing in a hallway with nothing prepared, saying only the truth. Serena Voss did not win by becoming cruel. She did not win by shouting. She did not win by performing her pain for an audience. She won by being patient, by being honest, by understanding, as Marcus Aurelius wrote and as Edward had underlined in his copy of the Meditations, that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Every person who tried to diminish her gave her instead a clearer picture of exactly what she was dealing with. Every attack clarified what she needed to do next. She did not waste her energy on anger that wouldn't help her. She saved it for the work. That is the lesson. Not that the world is fair, it is not always fair, but that a woman who knows who she is cannot be permanently undone by people who don't. If this story stayed with you, if something in Serena's patience or her grief, or her refusal to become what the worst moments asked her to become, felt familiar, then you already know what this story is really about. Not wealth, not revenge, not the satisfaction of watching someone fall. It's about knowing your own value when no one in the room is confirming it, and finding the patience to let the truth speak, in its own time, in its own way, at exactly the moment it chooses. I'll see you inside the next story. Before we say goodbye completely, I want to take a moment to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that transparency. This story is a work of fiction. Serena, Julian, Vivian, Edward, Helena, and every character you met today, they are imagined. The estate, the court filings, the shareholders' meeting, the Hamptons party, the foundation launch, All of it was created as part of a dramatic narrative. None of this represents a real person, a real family, or a real legal case. Any similarity to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real organizations and events, is entirely coincidental and unintentional. Stories like this exist not to deceive, but to reflect. To give shape and language to experiences that many real people carry quietly inside them. Betrayal, dignity, patience. The long, private work of rebuilding yourself after someone tries to define you as less than you are. That is the only truth this story was ever trying to tell. Thank you for watching. Thank you for trusting us with your time.